Hi folks, time to take a look back at March's reading, and it's been a pretty bumper month, as you'll see. First, let's start with a couple of also-rans that didn't quite make the finish line. The first of those is White Queen by Gwyneth Jones, and I've only just started this, but in the immortal words of Magnus Magnusson, I have started, so I'll finish, and this will roll over into April's reading. Very briefly, I'm about 60 pages in, and so far nothing makes sense, and I don't understand what's going on, but I'm sure that will change, or at least I hope it will, as I read on into the book proper. So more on that later. And then the one I haven't got to at all is The Labyrinth Key by, I always forget who it's by, Howard Hendricks, which is another book, along with White Queen, which is on the Broderick and De Filippo 101 best novels list. And I just ran out of time. I haven't got to it, so it'll go back on the shelves and we'll live to fight another day. So let's get on to the books that I actually finished. And there were quite a few, I think 16 if I've counted correctly, greatly helped by several of them being quite short audio books that I was able to listen to whilst I was out and about. Doing various things. So I'm going to quickly give you brief thoughts on each one. I'll rank them mercilessly as we go, and then at the end I'll declare a book of the month. So first up was Pushing Ice by Alastair Reynolds, which is one of his standalone books. It's not set in the Revelation Space universe. And this was a reread for me on audiobook this time, although I remembered almost nothing about it, having read it, I don't know, 20 odd years ago when it first came out. At the beginning of the book, we're in a meeting of something called the Congress of the Lindblad Ring, which is a far future interstellar community, seemingly of humans. And they're arguing the toss over how best to honour the memory of somebody called Bella Lind, who they hold responsible for the expansion of humanity across the stars. And then we flip back to the 2100s and we're with the Rockhopper and its crew, and they're busy mining comets. That's their gig and that's what the ship's designed to do. Janus, however, spoils the party a little bit. Janus is one of Saturn's moons and it's accelerating, heading out of the solar system, which is obviously not behaviour that you'd expect of your common garden moon. And the crew of the Rockhopper happen to be nearest, and so they're engaged in a mission to catch up with Janus and do some exploring while they still can, before it disappears for good out of the solar system. Due to unhappy accident or perhaps sabotage, there are a number of issues aboard the Rockhopper which ultimately result in a decision being necessary. Should they stick with the plan and try to catch up with Janus, or should they go home? Can they even get back at this stage? Will they have enough fuel? There are some major disagreements and differences of opinion, and tempers fray, and ultimately a schism erupts which will resonate down the following decades as the story unfolds. I can't tell you much about this book without spoiling something here, which I don't think is a major surprise. For reasons that become apparent in the book, Janus is now the home for the crew of the Rockhopper, at least temporarily, and they get busy building a ramshackle town for themselves. There are numerous aliens later in the book and an enormous big dumb object, all of which was done pretty well, I thought. Some of the aliens are offering aid and succour to the growing population on Janus, and some with tempting offers, but with hidden intentions, which may or may not be good for the residents of Janus. I like the bootstrapping of the early life on Janus, making the best of things as they found them. It reminded me a little bit of the early section on Seven Eves by Neil Stevenson when the crew are working on expanding and upgrading the ISS in anticipation of receiving some visitors, let's say. So there's a lot going on in this book. You've got enigmatic relics, some alien and some not, an envoy from the far future, or what might be the past, time dilation being what it is, given the speed that Janus has or is moving at. And then there's some very boring old human factional infighting and associated peril coming at them from assorted multiple directions. I enjoyed the story, and I like the dynamic between Bella and her one-time best friend and chief engineer Svetlana. I thought that was well done. Both characters are flawed and both acting in what they believe to be in the best interests of all. And unusually, perhaps, even for the early 2000s, both of the lead characters are, of course, female. So overall, I liked it. It's hard science fiction. It's a big dumb object tale in the tradition of Ringworld or Rama and Orbitsville. And then there's a side order of First Contact. I probably preferred House of Suns, but, I enjoyed my time. I give Pushing Ice 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next is Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang by Kate Wilhelm, of course, a Hugo-winning classic. The Sumner family live in a fertile, defensible valley in the Shenandoah region of Virginia, and the elders of the clan can see that things are going to pot in the world outside the valley. The birth rate is dropping alarmingly. Pollution and radiation are an issue. There's drought and famine and climate change, you name it, all manner of problems. Fortunately for the Sumner clan and perhaps for the story, they are not mere farmers, although they do a bit of that. Some of them are scientists, some are lawyers, some business people, and some of them are really quite wealthy. And the Sumner family get busy learning how to clone humans, building I thought, slightly implausible hospital and research facility in the caves which pepper the hills on their land. Fortunately, the premise is less important, I think, than the resulting human interest. Over a few skips forward in time, we end up in a world where the clan has expanded in number via several generations of clones. Trouble is brewing, though, where the clan are running out of vital supplies and they need to go out in the world to forage for knowledge and for scientific equipment in the devastated, depopulated cities. To add to the basic dangers of such a trek, it quickly transpires that the clones can't bear to be away from their stablemates. They're identical brothers and sisters. The empathic link between them is too strong. This is a problem that really needs to be solved, but in the solving of it, the community faces breakdown and a split, a schism. I thought that this book is a kind of charming mix of the human and the everyday and the hard science that Wilhelm brings to the tale. The characters are compelling, her prose is wonderful, and she conjures a bucolic image of the home valley, and the expeditions to the cities I thought were tense and at times thrillingly done. She does a nice job, I thought, on the relationships, some of them poignant and tragic. In the later stages of the book, we follow a chap called Mark, who's a child born naturally to an illicit pairing of two clones who are later hounded out of the valley for their sins. And Mark is bullied by the clone children and as a result ends up being pretty independently minded and curious in ways that are no longer possible for the clones to imitate. I liked what Kate Wilhelm did with this character as we see him grow into a self-assured man who might just be the saviour of humanity. I thought that Kate Wilhelm's writing, this is the first book of hers that I've read, I thought her writing was accessible and not at all fiddly. And it reminded me a little bit of Brian Aldiss in her descriptions of the environment of the valley that they live in, and I thought a little bit perhaps of Zena Henderson and in her treatment of the odd children. I enjoyed it. It's a very quick read. I whipped through it in no time. I give Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next up was The Holy Machine by Chris Beckett, and this was his debut novel from back in the early 2000s. In the world of the book, there's been over time a retreat from reason and a rise of fundamentalist religion of all stripes. Intolerance has become a widespread thing, and people that have been able to have run away, there's been a retreat to a city, Illyria, which I imagine to be something like Dubai or Singapore, but on the east coast of the Eastern Mediterranean. The city is a refuge for scientists and atheists, researchers, etc., and it is wealthy and high-tech compared to the increasingly backwards stateless that surround it. Robots in Illyria are common, and some of those are very realistic, the syntax. Plus, there's a ubiquitous virtual reality called SenSpace, which is highly immersive, as we'll see. We follow George Simling, who's a bit of a sad old loner, poorly socialised as a child or something, and he lives with his mother, who's addicted to SenSpace, and perhaps that's why. She spends nearly all of her waking hours in a full-body haptic suit, immersed in the game. Perhaps inevitably the most realistic of the robots, the syntax, are used for sex work. And George, being a bit of a sado, starts to get his rocks off visiting the robot whorehouses. And he takes a shine on his frequent visits to Lucy, a very beautiful syntax. George feels like he's getting to know Lucy and has spotted that she's beginning to glitch a little bit, starting to question her existence and her very nature. She is developing a bit of a personality. Unfortunately for George and perhaps for Lucy, self-evolving robots must be factory reset every 6 months to ensure their smooth operation. George is horrified that Lucy might get wiped like this and plans their escape. It's a rather half-assed, ill-conceived escape plan though, kind of like running from the frying pan and into the fire. Their only route to escape being into the outlands, the backward statelets that I referred to earlier, where robots of any kind, but especially the sexy syntax, are an abomination. Illyria is not perfect, far from it. There are issues with guest workers and their rights and their status, and there are increasingly strict edicts about religious beliefs, i.e. you can't have them, mirroring the intolerant scene in the outside world. It might have been easy for an author, particularly a science fiction author perhaps, to have us side with the rational scientists, the atheists of the piece, but Beckett is at pains to show that they're just as bad as the backwards godbotherers next door. Lucy, once a slutty caricature, a slave to her programming, is increasingly self-aware. A neat mirroring of George's mother Ruth, perhaps, who's sliding ever more into unawareness, spending all of her time in SenSpace. Lucy doesn't need to rest, so whilst George is getting his beauty sleep, she reads. They're in the ultra-religious outlands by this stage, where reading material is limited to holy books and religious screeds. She methodically works her way through it all, making as much sense of it as a robot can, a body of philosophy and meaning that becomes important, let's say, as the book proceeds. George's clumsy attempts to keep Lucy's true nature a secret do not survive sceptical questioning by the countrymen that they encounter as they travel around the outlands. And this isn't helped by Lucy's deep programming, her innate responses to any kind of attention by a man. And drunken incaution on George's part in one such exchange ends in disaster, but sets the stage for the later part of the book. Some redemption for George and an unexpected role for a much changed Lucy. I like Chris Beckett's writing style, whose prose is uncomplicated. He uses short, punchy sentences, each simple enough on its own, but woven together into cloth which in The Holy Machine examines some pretty interesting questions. He considers the nature of utopia, the very possibility of it in an imperfect world, the nature of sentience and humanity, the imbalances and dangers of intolerance of all kinds, the merits and dangers of virtual spaces, loneliness and extremes. There's a lot going on, and perhaps that's a minor failure, a trap for young players, let's say, this being his debut novel. But I really enjoyed my time in Holy Machine. I give it 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next up was These Burning Stars by Bethany Jacobs, a relatively recent book, I think from 2023 or 4 perhaps. We're in the Treble, which is an isolated outpost of human colonisation, which was reached long ago, it seems, by generation ship. There are 3 star systems, hence the name Treble, each with assorted planets, moons and orbitals, all quite deeply colonised. Across the 3 system, the human population numbers in the many billions. So it's pretty well established by this stage. The governing body is something called the Kingdom. That's kin, not kingdom, and that's a religious order of sorts. It sort of maintains a fragile peace between the various factions and the leading families. And These Burning Stars is ultimately a tale of revenge and, to a degree, of loyalty. We're quickly introduced to the 3 main characters. Essex Nightfoot is a senior cleric in the Kingdom, and she's a scion of one of the first families, and she's busy looking for novitiates that she can take into her service to continue their training. The pupils at the prep school are numbered, they don't yet warrant a name, and Essex is impressed by 6. And she sets 6 a little challenge to impress her even more, to do something sufficiently extraordinary that she might warrant a place at some point in the future in her household. What 6 chooses to do in the intervening decades is indeed extraordinary, and it's revealed as the book progresses. Much of the story is a cat and mouse chase between Essex, with Chono, a classmate of 6, in tow, and 6, who Essex can't decide if she wants to kill or to adopt. The structure of the book is interesting. Most of the action takes place in 1664, in the way that they reckon time, the year of the Crux, with flashbacks to earlier periods in the lives of Essex, Chono and 6, which fill in some of the blanks of the story, and that timeline gradually catches up with the main storyline. Essex is the likely heir to the Nightfoot family trade and influence in the Kingdom, and she must make a choice between her role as a senior, but not terribly devout, honestly, cleric, and this more secular role. But there exist recordings from decades back that might harm the Nightfoots, maybe even destroy their reputation and standing in the Treble. Numerous of the characters in the book spend time chasing after these recordings, some to protect them, some to damage them, and some to use them for leverage. Essex is also obsessed with tracking down 6, who's linked to the recordings in some way, but 6 is pretty good at not being found, and she might just have the measure of Essex. The central relationship, the tension and the loyalty triangle, we might call it, between Essex, Chono and 6, I thought was well done. So These Burning Stars is a space opera out and out, but it's a space opera of the zeitgeist. Gender is selected at a certain age. There are female or non-binary protagonists. There are pronouns galore and fluid sexuality. I didn't feel at all that was forced or gratuitous. The author just laid that out as part of the setting, and I thought it worked well. I don't like it when I get beaten over the head with that kind of thing, but this was just part of the natural flow of things. I didn't object to it at all. I quite enjoyed it, in fact. So overall, I enjoyed my time in this book. I really love the setting. I thought that was richly done, and I got a good sense of the deep history and the complexity and the flavour of the Treble. I think if you liked Ancillary Justice, then I think you'd also enjoy this book, although I think this is a better story, actually. I think it's a really strong debut from Bethany Jacobs. And there is a second book out on Vicious Worlds, and I gather that it will ultimately become a trilogy, and I will definitely be reading on. I give These Burning Stars 8 out of 10. It's quite literally a stellar splendour. Next up was The Yiddish Policemen's Union by Michael Chabon, and I've not read anything by Michael Chabon before this, but he is a Pulitzer Prize winner, and I think that shows in the quality of his writing in the book. The setting in this one is an alternate history in which the state of Israel never really got off the ground. The Jewish diaspora instead were offered a piece of land on the coast of Alaska, centred on the settlement of Sitka, which ultimately becomes a sizable Jewish city, a semi-autonomous state within a state. But we're now in the early 2000s and the clock is ticking. Sitka is due to be returned to US control as part of the state of Alaska once more, a process known as the reversion. The book is science fiction by virtue of it being an alternate history, but really this is an out-and-out police procedural, albeit with other strong flavours as a result of the unusual setting. As you'd expect in a police procedural, there's been a murder. A man has been shot in the back of the head, and the murder has taken place in the same hostel, the same dingy flophouse that police detective Meyer Landsman now calls home, his marriage having fallen apart some time back. I won't talk about the central mystery and the detecting and police work that goes on. That's a story best left to you to read untroubled by any clues from me. I did enjoy those aspects of the book, but for me, I think the greater joy was in the writing, the language and the setting. I revelled in it. Chabon has a wonderful turn of phrase, a way of describing something, the look and the feel of it, which I thought was lovely without being too arch or clever, without getting in the way of the story. There's an interesting dynamic between Meyer and his immediate superior, Bina Gelbfish, who happens to be his ex-wife. I really enjoyed their back and forth, her weary despair and concern and obvious remaining love at Meyer's decline and his sense of loss and bewilderment at being single once more. I thought that the seedy underbelly of Sitka was really well done, with sights and sounds, smells even jumping off the page and into my imagination via Chabon's, I thought, wonderful writing. The language is wonderful. There are lashings of Yiddish words, a small number familiar, but most of the time the context was really the only clue as to the meaning. And I thought that added a huge amount of depth and colour to the story. The reversion looms large over everything, with related uncertainties and fears underlying almost everything in Sitka. Some are small scale, what does it mean for me and my job? And some large and existential. What does it mean for the Jewish people of Sitka? Can they stay? Where will they go next? For some, that means that eyes are turning once again to the Holy Land. So it's Yiddish noir. Sitka is cold and rainy and dark and grimy. And through Meyer and his investigations, we get a good view of the way that the city works, the various factions, the ultra-Orthodox, the Messianic, the criminal gangs, and the political classes. I thought that it had depth and heft, a real flavour of its own. I had a wonderful time. I thoroughly recommend it. I give the Yiddish Policemen's Union 10 out of 10, a rare occurrence for me. I think it's only happened once before. And it's a nailed-on galactic gem, and I think an early contender for my book of the year. It's really, really good. Next, I continued my wary re-entry into the Ballardian with High Rise, my third Ballard book. We're in a 40-storey apartment building. It's pretty upscale. It's certainly not intended for the great unwashed, as it were. It's one of 4 or 5 buildings in a new development, each providing all of the amenities of modern life, from supermarkets to a gym, to a beauty parlour, to boutiques, a swimming pool, and even a school. Each tower is a self-contained microcosm, a vertical town. The High Rise is a tale of the thin veneer of civilization that makes society work after a fashion. Ballard explores just how thin that veneer is, how liable to wear and tear, and to being rent asunder and ultimately shed entirely. It's an examination of class, the petty differences and attitudes, even amongst the striations of the comparatively well-to-do folks that live in the building. The professional classes, the doctors, the airline pilots and the lawyers of the piece live in the central floors. And the upper middle classes, the top section, the snooty, the country club set, live on the upper floors. And of course, the more workaday folks are in the lower floors, the office workers, the air stewardesses, the television producers and the like. It's almost like the building exerts some kind of malign influence, some kind of collective psychosis on the inhabitants. Or does it? Is the building actually an entirely inert presence in the story, a neutral venue, simply a vessel for the rapid unravelling that takes place within? Is the behaviour of the residents a response to their environment, or is it merely facilitated by it? I read High Rise as a peculiar sort of English catastrophe. All right, there's no external event, there's no plague or war or zombies or a comet strike, none of that. Just the envies and the petty concerns that moved into the building with the people. But that's enough to bring about a fall contained within the building. There's a compelling sense of almost hysterical energy to the book. Parties quickly get out of control, things are thrown from the upper balconies, violence is triggered by the most minor provocation, and people are ready to try anything, however transgressive. High Rise tracks a descent into the animalistic, to the savage and the uncivilised. Language is even a casualty for some folks near the end. Ballard does a great job evoking the decline through mounting garbage, the scattered detritus of broken things, the increasingly disgusting state of the swimming pool, the barricades, battles over food and supplies, for control of the elevators. Even the exterior of the building doesn't entirely escape a kind of scum of discarded waste gradually staining the walls and littering the car park beneath. High Rise then is a vehicle for exploring the fragile boundary between order and chaos, taking a close look at what makes civilization work by unpicking it piece by piece. There are no sympathetic characters, or no one that I was really rooting for anyway. There's no plot as such, other than the great unravelling, the descent into savagery. It's Lord of the Flies in vertical form. I did think that the women in High Rise are rather underserved, probably just a reflection of the time. For the most part, they're either stay-at-home trophy wives, but later sexual currency to be traded and stolen or protected. Very few have agency of their own, limited to what they choose to offer in exchange for that protection. Only at the end of the book do we get some sense of the women organising and achieving some kind of power over the increasingly savage men. Not, mind you, that the women aren't also capable of some savagery of their own. Somewhat to my surprise, given my history with Ballard, I give High Rise 8 out of 10. I think it's a stellar splendour. Next was Jack Glass by Adam Roberts, and this is not a whodunit as such, it's more of a why-done-it and a how-done-it. In this story, the solar system is teeming with billions, trillions even, of people, the vast majority of them dirt poor, living in shanty bubbles. The prison system in this world is privatised, and conflict labour is used to hollow out asteroids for future prime real estate. And at the beginning of the book, Jack Glass, the lead character, is imprisoned with 6 others, along with the bare minimum of equipment, and they must work quickly together to make enough space to work and to live and to get their little fusion generator working, just to provide some heat and some water that they can drink. With 7 convicts in a confined space, you quickly draw the conclusion that there may be trouble ahead. And indeed, this opening section is pretty full on with some of the usual prison violence, sexual assault and power games. Jack Glass has been imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. No, his crime is much worse. And Jack Glass needs to get out before the authorities realise who they've caught. Now, how do you escape from an asteroid that's literally in the middle of nowhere? That is the central mystery of the opening section. It is essentially a prison break. Then we flip to 2 teenage girls down on Earth. They're both super smart and both daughters of one of the leading families of the solar system, one rung down from the boss of it all. One of the servants has been murdered, but by whom and why? The book is a series of nested mysteries, and those are just 2 of them, all in the service of a broader story, which wraps up nicely by the end, answering the how and the why of it all. I liked it. Adam Roberts' prose is uncomplicated, and I enjoyed listening to it on audiobook, narrated in this case by Elliot Chapman. It moves along briskly, and I liked the mystery elements. It reminded me somewhat of my enjoyment as a kid of the Sherlock Holmes books, but obviously with a much more science fiction setting. I give Jack Glass 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next is the first of 4 H.G. Wells books to appear in this recap, all of them listened to on audiobook. The first up is War of the Worlds, which in this case was narrated by David Tennant. I know the story, you know the story too. It's been part of our collective awareness for over 100 years now, but I don't think I've actually read it before. I think this was my first time reading it. Considering it's over 120 years old, I think it still holds up extremely well. The War of the Worlds is an invasion story from Mars, of course. The War of the Worlds, of course, tells the story of an invasion from Mars, their own planet, in the process of dying. And the basic structure's familiar from my other reference points, chiefly the Jeff Way musical and the movies, of course. But I did enjoy the more detailed view that we get in the book. The horror of the heat ray is well conveyed, as is the sense of growing panic. At first, it's pretty local. This is a world of poor and slow communications, telegraph being the most advanced thing. But word and the panic that goes with it soon spreads. I particularly enjoyed the flight of millions from a London besieged by Martian tripods, burning and gassing everything in sight. Our narrator is a writer, I think, and he has the misfortune to live very near the first landing on Horsell Common. He witnesses the emergence from the partly buried cylinder of the Martians and their immediate destruction of the white flag waving delegation that's sent to meet them. He makes a run for it very sensibly, squirreling his wife away in a nearby town and returning to absolute mayhem. From that point on, our protagonist is either running from or hiding from the dastardly and merciless Martians. He gets caught up with a soldier whose entire unit has been wiped out, and later a curate, a man of God, who's totally fallen apart. Our man is trapped with this particularly whiny character in a house almost flattened by a Martian cylinder when it crash lands. The scenes in the ruins of this house were quite tense and well done, I thought, although by the end of that section I did want to give the curate a good slap. I was reminded actually of some of the scenes in The Day of the Triffids, the quiet London streets in particular, scenes of panic as normal life breaks down. Perhaps an echo down the years, one of many I'm sure, of the broad influence of H.G. Wells on the genre. I had a blast reading this. I enjoyed it much more than I thought I might, and I give The War of the Worlds 9 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. I went straight from The War of the Worlds to another influential stone cold classic that invented an entire subgenre, a foundation stone of science fiction. Yes, it was time for The Time Machine. I was much less familiar with this story, so I was coming to it more or less fresh. It's another short book and was therefore a quick listen. I was done in a few hours. Our protagonist and narrator is referred to in the book simply as the Time Traveller. He's a Victorian, an amateur scientist, and he's invented a time machine, of course he has, which he's been busy showing off to some of his friends at dinner. After some preliminaries, he sends himself off in, or rather on, the time machine, and in the story we see him return later in the meal looking really dishevelled. He's clearly been through some stuff, and he proceeds to tell his tale to his sceptical friends. Turns out he's gone over 800,000 years into the future, in which there's little trace of our civilization. It's an utterly changed world. He finds some strange beings there that he comes to know are called the Eloi, and they're almost childlike in both their behaviour and their appearance. They're docile and friendly, hooting and cooing at each other by way of communication. And they're all petrified of the dark, and we soon find out why. Our time traveller goes on a bit of a recce when he gets there, and when he returns, his time machine has vanished. He's trapped 800,000 years in the future. At night, particularly on moonless nights, from beneath the ground appear many-legged monkey-type creatures, the Morlocks, that will either snatch you or eat you, or both. Quite horrifying, and our man suspects them of having taken his time machine. He starts to postulate that the Eloi and the Morlocks are both branches of humanity, with the Morlocks essentially farming the docile Eloi for food. The Morlocks are a rather on-the-nose proxy for the great unwashed, and the Eloi for the upper echelons of Victorian society, a kind of commentary on the class divisions of the time. We know that our time traveller gets back in time for brandy after dinner in 18 whatever it is, so he must have retrieved his time machine somehow. And Wells goes on to tell that story, which involves a terrifying flight through a pitch-dark forest with Morlocks on his tail, and a desperate scrap and a last-second operation of the time machine, throwing him even further into the future, eventually millions of years. Weeks or months of subjective time have passed for the time traveller, but he returns to dinner just 3 hours after he left. For all of its firsts, the first time travel story, the first time machine, the first glimpse of a far future dying Earth, I give The Time Machine 7 out of 10. It was a planetary pleasure. Next up was The Invisible Man, another story which has sunk deep into the cultural psyche, but again, which I've never read. Griffin is a scientist specialising in optics, and he's invented a way to change the refractive index of human flesh, equalising it with that of air. And in true Victorian scientist fashion, the first thing he does is to apply his new technique to himself. But oh no, he's unable to reverse it. Griffin, whether he likes it or not, is now the Invisible Man. Griffin then rocks up at a village inn run by a Mr. and Mrs. Hall, and it's the dead of winter and the snow is falling outside. And the Invisible Man is got up in the iconic Invisible Man outfit of an overcoat, a broad-brimmed hat, sunglasses, a fake nose, and lots of bandages. He does look a bit odd, but Mrs. Hall doesn't often get tenants in the winter, so she's happy to take his coin, despite his odd appearance and rather rude manner. Griffin, in the end, becomes a massive pain in her arse. He's rude, he's demanding, he's obsessive, banging and crashing about at all hours. And he's turned her parlour into a science lab, and is generally a very odd individual, generating a certain amount of gossip in the village. The local constabulary get involved when there's a burglary in the village, just at the time when the Invisible Man is running short of funds. Coincidence? I think not. And what does an Invisible Man do when he's confronted by the local constabulary? Why? He immediately gets undressed, vanishing himself in the process. And from this point on, Griffin is on the run. He gets caught up with a vagrant who he bullies into fetching and carrying for him, and by this time there's a general hue and cry out for him. There are rumours of an Invisible Man are spreading, and groups of men are searching the countryside for likely hiding places. Griffin is a nasty piece of work, actually, and not a very sympathetic character at all, seeming to relish his role as some kind of new bogeyman. He eventually holes up in the house of Dr. Kemp, an acquaintance of Griffin's from medical school. Relieved at finding a familiar face, he proceeds to tell Kemp and us of his experiments and how he came to be invisible. The tale ends with a final chase across the countryside, with Griffin dodging pursuers until he's finally cornered. Of the 3 H.G. Wells books that I binged on the bounce here, I like this one the least. I didn't dislike it, but I just didn't like it quite as much as the rest. Maybe I just overdosed on Victorian prose by this point, or perhaps Griffin is just less likeable than the other protagonist. Regardless, I do give The Invisible Man 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next up was a reread for me, Helliconia Spring by Brian Aldiss, this time back in physical book form. I read this as a teenager after buying a set of 3 from my local independent bookshop. I actually bounced off it pretty hard, I think, the first time I read it, but I picked it up again 2 or 3 years later, and I, as far as I remember, enjoyed it much more, reading through all 3 books. Aldiss imagines a world, Helliconia, which orbits one star with the usual pattern of days and years, albeit longer than ours. And then, but it's a binary star, and that whole system orbits around another star with quite stark effects on the long-range climate on Helliconia. It's an elliptical orbit. We actually begin Helliconia Spring in winter. Humanity is hanging on by its fingertips in the extreme cold. And I did find on rereading it for the third time that the opening is slow and maybe even a little bit unengaging. Aldiss hurries through quite a bit of history to get to the interesting bits 2 or 3 generations down the line. Yuli is a young man. He's out hunting with his father when the Fagors attacked, the Fagors being the other sentient race on Helliconia. Much better suited to the extreme temperatures of the long winter, the Fagor are the abominable snowmen of the piece. Separated from his father, Yuli ends up in Panaval, an underground city with quite a sophisticated society, and years later he's on the move again though with a small group of fellow travellers. And the group merge with an existing settlement to form a new town. Flash forward 2 generations and Yuli's grandson is now an old man, losing his grip on power. And the weather is very slowly improving with each passing year as distant Freya, the second star, gets closer. Or rather, they get closer to it. And for me, this is where the story takes off. So I think if you are considering giving it a go, do stick with it for the first 100 or so pages. I do think it pays off. The whole Helliconia trilogy is a study of the implications of the long-range climate cycle on the life on Helliconia. As the story progresses, we get more and more evidence of how life has adapted to this cycle, from microbes to ticks to plant and animal life, including the humans and the Fagors. Many of the flora and fauna find ways to go dormant or to transform into some more basic form of life for the long centuries of extreme cold. And the waxing and the waning of life, the turning of influence and the power of the humans and the Fagor, and what turns out to be their codependence, I thought is the most interesting aspect of the novel. Civilization is another casualty of the long winter. Records, knowledge, history itself is lost to the ravages of the extreme cold and the battle for basic survival. And each time it warms up, civilization is made anew on the meagre bones of the past attempts. And it's quite near the end of this first book before the first wheel appears, for example. I really enjoyed that aspect of the book, more than I enjoyed the actual story, if I'm honest, although the two things are, of course, somewhat intertwined. Based partly on the slowish start, I give Helliconia Spring 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. Next, I read The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, of course. And this is a collection of short stories. And the stories are broadly unrelated, but Bradbury ties them together via a heavily tattooed man, the illustrated man of the title. And there's a supernatural element to his tattoos, that the pictures on his body, which is covered by tattoos, move. And they change over time as well. And the narrator of the story meets the illustrated man at the very beginning, and the stories unfold on the man's body. I have read Fahrenheit 451, but it was a long time ago, so The Illustrated Man is effectively a reintroduction for me to Bradbury's prose style, which I felt was wistful and reflective, maybe even a bit sad and whimsical, a tone of regret perhaps. But it did make for engaging storytelling, I thought. There are 17 or 18 stories in this book in total, and a few of them stood out for me. There's one called The Veldt, which has a high-tech house with an immersive projection room, and of course the kids spend too much time in there. The parents are forced to intervene and the kids reluctantly agree to limit their time in there, but they plot their revenge. There's another one called The Other Foot, in which Mars has been settled exclusively by black folks who either fled or were kicked off Earth. And a rocket appears from Earth believed to contain white folks' shock horror. And a lynch mob is got up revenge for centuries of oppression. And of course, when the rocket arrives, cooler heads prevail. Another favourite of mine was Marionettes, in which distant husbands fob their wives off with robot copies of themselves so they can bugger off to Rio to have fun. But what's sauce for the gander in this case is also sauce for the goose. And the wives and the robots have other ideas. I really enjoyed listening to this. The next one from him should probably be The Martian Chronicles. And I give The Illustrated Man 8 out of 10. It's a stellar splendour. Next up was A Dream of Wessex by Christopher Priest. And I've read a few of his books now, and I think I'm beginning to get a handle of the way that he writes. He likes to unsettle his reader pretty early on in the book. This one is grounded in a late 20th century England, within something called the Wessex Foundation, which is based under the Mound at Maiden Castle, which is in Dorset in the south of England. The Wessex Foundation is engaged in the process of sending people to the future, sort of, in a manner of speaking. What they're actually doing is performing a collective projection of a designed future 150 years hence. And Priest reveals little details about this future as the book progresses. There's been an earthquake at some point in this future's past, if that makes sense. And the Wessex, which is not really a place anymore, is a name from antiquity. But anyway, Wessex is now an island a little bit off the coast of England, and there's a channel separating Wessex from the rest of England, and twice a day with the tide there's a giant tidal bore which races up this thing and becomes quite high, 50 or 60 metres for a really good one that people risk their lives to surf. And there are other nice details. England, or some of it, is now run by Soviet Russia, although that's in the dim and distant past. Wessex, in particular Dorchester, now seems to be very tranquil and idyllic. Our protagonist is Julie Stretton. She's a young geologist, and she is sent, amongst others, into this fully immersive virtual world. And the projectors, when they get there, kind of lose their grip on their real selves. It's a sort of death almost. The facility that they're in is even called the morgue. David Harkman has been projecting for 2 years and is no longer responding to the retrieval process, and Julie is sent in to find him. Now, another of the characters is Paul Mason, who's Julie's abusive ex, and he's, it becomes clear, coercive and controlling, but like many who are that way inclined, he presents an effusive, likeable face to everybody else. And over Julie's objections, Paul gets added to the projection team and things go bad from there. I found this book enchanting and unsettling. The lines between the real and the virtual are very much blurred. What even is real? Does it matter? It really made me question what I was reading. And towards the end of the book, Priest really messes with our heads, and I shall leave it there. I think this is my favourite Christopher Priest book to date, even more enjoyable than Inverted World. I give A Dream of Wessex 9 out of 10. It's a galactic gem. Next, another H.G. Wells, this time The Island of Dr. Moreau, and it's another early science fiction classic, published in 1896. And maybe it's the first uplift story, although you could argue that Frankenstein fits that category too. Edward Prendick is our protagonist. He's an educated man, but he's shipwrecked. But he's rescued close to death and revived by somebody called Montgomery. And the ship he's now on is a floating menagerie, all apparently owned by Montgomery. Prendick gets some insight into what he'll eventually deal with later by meeting Meling, who's Montgomery's sidekick, a bestial manservant of sorts. Much to his dismay, Prendick is kicked off the ship when they reach Montgomery's destination. The captain's had enough of all his passengers. And this is the titular island of Dr. Moreau, who Prendick vaguely remembers hearing about. He's a renowned physiologist, but what on earth is he doing out here in the middle of the South Pacific? Prendick soon meets some of the other inhabitants. They're kind of half man, half beast characters. Prendick feels like he's being held prisoner by Moreau and fears being operated on to have some animal's head sewn onto his body. He can hear all manner of screams and cries and grunts and groans and roars coming from Moreau's jungle laboratory. But he has it all wrong. Moreau is not about turning humans into animals. He's about turning base animals into humans, or something approaching it, via surgery. Of the 4 Wells books that I've listened to this month, I like this one the least, I think. It seemed wildly implausible to me in a way that Time Travel, An Invisible Man and A Martian Invasion didn't. It didn't hold my attention in the same way as the others, and I often lost my thread and had to re-listen to entire chapters as my mind wandered. And as a result, I give The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I don't actually have a physical copy of, 6 out of 10. It's a nebulous narrative. Next up was Kiteworld by Keith Roberts, author of Pavane, amongst other things. And a little bit like Pavane, I think, the Kiteworld is episodic. It's a chain of loosely connected short stories, some longer than others, approaching novella length in one case, in fact. Keith Roberts does not explain the setting. He gives clues as to the possible location that we're in and past events. Maybe we're in a post-nuclear war situation at some point in the past. We're in a place called the Realm, which seems to be England or somewhere quite like it. And in this world, the kites and the people that man and maintain them are core to society. The kites, doctrinally speaking, are there to ward off demons. And they're steam-driven, or at least the launchers are. And there are giant coils of ropes, and there's a whole kite punk vocabulary to go with it. The kite men and the people that work with them are the cream of society, and they're looked up to and liable to get a free drink anytime they walk into a bar. There are some really wonderful characters in this book, and I particularly like Velvet, the kite waif, who features in 2 or 3 of the stories towards the end of the book. All are subservient to the church variant, which runs the kites and the realm. And I think this is a really fabulous example of world building. It feels very solid and very real, peopled by very believable, rough and ready folk. We get a look at the kite flyers, the maintainers, the suppliers, the chaplains, the aristocrats, or at least the well-to-do, and the churchmen, of course, some of them harsh and dogmatic and others pretty worldly. Roberts puts his main characters through some stuff, relationship stuff. There are lovers, friendships, brother and sister relationships, and father-daughter relationships I thought were done really well. And as I say, I really liked Velvet, a rough diamond character. And then Mistress Kerosina sounded delightfully corrupt and corrupting. I thought Tan was well done. She was described as autistic on the blurb, and probably rightly so, I think, based on how Keith wrote the character. And I thought that her relationship with her brother was lovely until it wasn't, becoming creepy, ending badly for both of them. I really enjoyed my time with this book, and I'm now even keener to read Purveyne. I give Kiteworld 9 out of 10. It's another galactic gem. Next up was Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock, of course, and this was my first Moorcock, my first Elric, one of 5 in an Elric omnibus on Audible. And this is a classic fantasy tale. Elric is a slightly wimpy character. He's a bit weak, requiring drugs to maintain his strength. But he is the emperor of Melniboné, and he has a hot girlfriend to boot. But his cousin, Imric, I think his name is, covets the throne, criticising Elric's lack of robustness. He just isn't leading like what an emperor should. Cousin Elric has hatched a dastardly plan, which Elric unfortunately walks straight into. And that should be the end of Elric, but he has friends in what turn out to be low places. The rest of the book is a back and forth between Elric and his cousin, one trying to steal the throne and one trying to steal it back. There are magical mirrors, boats that go over land, there are demons and chaos lords, impressive demonic swords, which I understand feature large in the Elric story going forward. I thought this was a pretty good introduction to Elric, but Moorcock's writing didn't especially stick out to me one way or the other. But I did have a good time, and I may well listen to the other 4 in the omnibus as opportunity presents. I thought it was a serviceable and by today's standard an extremely briskly told fantasy epic with some good introductions to what I think will be interesting characters. I give Elric of Melniboné 7 out of 10. It's a planetary pleasure. All of which means that my book of the month for March 2025 is The Yiddish Policemen's Union by Michael Chabon. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.